What if our food chain has indeed been, quote, infiltrated by enzymes, artificial proteins, artificial saccharides, glucose, or sugars? What if our highly processed food chain is indeed replete with all kinds of molecules that will disturb our cellular memory? Is it possible that that old saying, you are what you eat, has way, way more validity than we ever gave it credit for? In other words, if we eat things that perhaps have the ability to block antioxidants, that have the ability to disturb our cellular memory, if we do those things, literally our personalities can change. Hi, Dr. Scott Jensen here. Welcome back to the Dr. Scott Jensen podcast. Once again, I'd remind you that the book I wrote, We've Been Played, can be purchased at drscottjensenbook.com. I've said numerous times before, and I'll say it again, part of the motivation for this podcast are the words of George Orwell. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. It's unfortunate that that is the time we live in. Having said that, there's a lot of serious issues in front of us. I generally try to confine the topics that I address to safety and accountability, to freedom, to education of our kids as well as our students of all ages, and to transparency and to tyranny, wherever you might find it, and to yours and my future. Well, today, I want to talk about something that has to do with freedom, but in an odd way. You see, it's my view that if you want to talk to a warrior for freedom, you might want to talk about Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. You might wonder, who's Jordan Peterson? He's a relatively famous psychologist from Canada who over the last decade or two has become prominent in his ability to analyze various topics of the day, various aspects of our everyday lives from a both psychological perspective, because he is a psychologist, as well as from almost a scientific mathematic model. He has an ability to look at what percentage of people would do this, or what percentage of people need to hear about this. For example, there are times where Jordan Peterson will speak with such clarity on an issue that is clearly bubbled up in our society, but nobody has wanted to touch it. So here he comes. He says, if we're going to be free, we have to be able to talk about this. Here's my thoughts. Take a look at this video.
This is lecture 6, and it's on sex differences in personality. And so the first thing that you should be aware of, this is the reason I put it in after neuroticism and agreeableness, is that the biggest differences in temperament, personality, between men and women are in agreeableness and neuroticism. And that seems to be true cross-culturally. And so, because one of the things you want to know is, so look what's happened, is that psychologists have established a relatively atheoretical model of personality. And I don't believe that there was any bias built into it, or at least that the bias was minimized by the method, because the method was ask people as many questions as you possibly can and use statistical methods by multiple teams to sort out the relationships between the answers. And I thought the Big Five was a pretty ugly theory when I first came across it. It wasn't one that I warmed up to quickly. I would say it probably took between 5 and 10 years before I was convinced by the brute power of the analysis that it had to be taken seriously. And as that happened, because the theory was first laid out only linguistically and statistically, there was no neuropsychology, there was no neurobiology, there was no real theory, there was no developmental theory, it was just lexical description. And so it was like a theory in search of a place to exist as well, because Of course, before it was established, we didn't know what it was also capable of predicting. And that all got built up around that, say, 5 to 10 year period too. And it became more, as we started to understand the relationship between the descriptors and the underlying biology, then the theory became richer and more useful and also more credible. But that actually had certain benefits. Its lack of initial theoretical attractiveness, because it also mitigated against bias, because if you find a theory attractive for whatever reason, then you're more likely to maybe be biased in favor of evidence that support it. And I really don't believe that the people who developed the Big Five theory were very much affected by that. I mean, there are people who built their reputation on the theory, and of course they would be biased in favor of pushing their career forward, but peer review, when it's done properly, keeps that nicely under control. And then the fact that multiple different methods have converged on the same model, and that there's pretty good evidence that it remains, reasonably stable cross-culturally, and that it's associated with the child developmental literature. That's all pretty powerful convergent evidence. And so, well, once you have the theory laid out, you can start to use it to ask and answer interesting questions like, well, are there differences between men and women? That'd be the first pretty simple question. And the next question would be, if there are differences, well then why did those differences exist? But you don't have to get to that to begin with. You can just start with, are there differences? And the answer is, yes, there are differences.
Okay, so back to Jordan Peterson. Over the last year, he and I have had a chance to develop a relationship. He helped guide me in terms of some of the decisions I was making regarding the Minnesota Board of Medical Practice coming after my license with 6 different investigations. Dr. Peterson has been both a friend and, if you will, a mentor. And I had a chance to meet with him personally in London a few months ago. We had a chance to talk about things then. He has been, so to speak, on the hot seat in Canada regarding a psychology board. And from Dr. Peterson's perspective, the psychology board in Ontario evidently wants to, quote, re-educate him. Good luck with that. But I think over the last few days, I've read more and more about what Jordan has been exploring. And he made this comment the other day on social media, something to this effect. When you read an article like this, it really makes you ponder the fullness of human experience. What was the article he was referring to? It was from Science Direct. It was called Medical Hypotheses, and the title of the article was Personality Changes Following Heart Transplantation, The Role of Cellular Memory. It's written by Mitchell Leister. So I hadn't thought about that for a little while. In the past, I've had patients ask me if they might have acquired personality traits of people who had, in one way or another, donated to their body. You might be wondering, what do I mean? Well, if someone gets a unit of blood, I've had patients ask me, am I going to get any characteristics or any input from someone I don't know? And we've seen that question come up with heart transplants, lung transplants, liver transplants. And Dr. Jordan Peterson highlighted this article. So I read it, and I want to talk about it with you. But before I do that, I decided to make sure that I wasn't venturing too far outside mainstream media. So I went back and did a research study on it. And I found an article in NPR. Now, NPR is, they have a chapter in Minnesota called NPR, public radio. And I think it's typically regarded as perhaps leaning slightly left, so I hope that provides a certain neutrality to what I'm going to say. But the question is, what can change our personality, and how do we remember what our personality is? So the title of this article by NPR was, Personalities Don't Usually Change Quickly, but They May Have During the Pandemic. And it was written by Maggie Mertens, October 5th, 2022. And this is what it said. Typically, major personality traits remain fairly stable throughout life. It's rare to see population-wide personality shifts. A new study in the journal PLOS psychologists found just that in the wake of the pandemic, that it's rare to see population-wide personality shifts. But surveys have been done, and there was a researcher named Sutton, and she and her team analyzed surveys from 3 time periods: pre-pandemic, before March 2020, early lockdown period in 2020, and then 21 and 22. And all of the responses came from Longitudinal Understanding America study. They looked at 5 areas for studying personality. Number 1, neuroticism or stress. Number 2, extroversion or connecting with others. Number 3, openness or creative thinking. Number 4, agreeableness, being trusting. And 5, conscientiousness or being organized, disciplined, and responsible. They looked at those 5 areas. They found some interesting things. The general rule is that life events don't have widespread impact on personality. They were hoping that further study would determine whether personality changes that their study of those 5 areas revealed would be sustained over a lifetime or be more of short-term shock. In other words, if we have events impacting on our personality, is it because of the shock? In other words, if we changed our personality during COVID, was it because of that was fast, hard, intrusive, or is it going to be a lifetime change? I thought that was interesting. So then I turned to an article into the arena of medicine per se. So Dr. Thomas Verney, an MD, wrote an article in 2021, Heart Transplants, Personality Transplants. And he says that the key point of his article is that, like the nervous system, the heart possesses the properties of memory and adaptation. Isn't that interesting? Think about that. The heart, not the brain, because most of us think our personality resides in our brains. But here, the heart possesses the properties of memory and adaptation. He goes on to talk about David Glanzman at UCLA successfully transferred a memory from one snail to another by extracting components of the nervous system and transplanting it, injecting it into a different snail. And this was a memory of electrical shock. So shock a snail, perhaps more than once, and a memory will be created. Take a portion of that snail's nervous system, transplant it into another snail, and you see that same response that normally wouldn't be there were it not for the shocking. In a similar vein, Shelley Berger at the University of Pennsylvania experimented with mice, and she discovered that after a conditioning and learning trial, a metabolic enzyme affecting key memory genes could be changed. We oftentimes talk about, with memory, about the epigenetic transfer of memory. And what that means in the world of medicine is there's a plant that exists, and in order for it to flower in the spring, it has to experience an extended period of cold weather. If it doesn't experience that cold weather, it will not flower in the spring. That characteristic isn't necessarily something that is developed and demonstrated in all of those plants. They have to be trained to do that. And if they are, what's interesting is those plants' offsprings will demonstrate the same thing, that they require a period of long, extended cold weather in order for them to flower. So clearly, we have the ability to transfer memory in a way other than just transplanting brain. So there was a paper by Paul Purcell, and he had interviewed transplant recipients, and many of them said that they had experienced profound changes in their personality and their lifestyle, changes in food, music, art, sexual, recreational, and career preferences. So heart transplant ends up not being simply replacing a diseased organ with a healthy one. There's much more than that. In one study, 6% of people who received a transplant reported a distinct change of personality due to their new hearts. If you Google the words personality changes following organ transplantation, what you'll find is that personality changes following heart are all over the scientific literature. But it's not just heart, it's also lung and liver. One woman had a fascinating experience where she said that she feels love differently. Daily Mail reports on a woman who said, "My personality changed after my kidney transplant." The question then is, why? Why do we experience personality changes with organ transplants? A cross-sectional study done in 2022, 47 people, demonstrated that people do experience personality changes in 89% of the time. So 89% of the time, if you get an organ transplant, your personality may change. There were more than 144,000 organs transplanted in 2021 worldwide. 40,000 hearts were transplanted. This is a growing number. This is a long ways away from Christian Bernard with the first one in 1967. What kinds of personality changes are seen post-transplant? The foods we like, our emotional responses, what TV shows we like, religious beliefs, even memories. The majority of participants in this study that I mentioned earlier, 89% reported changes in their personality following transplant. So does changing the heart mean you're going to change personality? No, but there was one study that indicated that 89% of people receiving transplants did indeed experience personality change. So now we're back to the study that piqued Dr. Jordan Peterson's interest, personality changes following heart transplantation. And this study talked about, how do we actually remember things? Is it just through the brain? This study went deep into the science and talked about cellular memory. In other words, our individual cells hold on to memory, either through DNA, RNA, protein, or what I mentioned earlier when I said epigenetic memory, where the expression of a gene on DNA or RNA will be shaped and then repeat itself in its offspring. But I think where things get quite interesting is when we start to think about, does this impact on our relationships with the people around us? So I thought, well, what kind of an experience could I look into that would help all of us sort of bond with this idea? And I thought, well, let's talk about anesthesia. So I read some articles on anesthesia, and anesthesia oftentimes will change the way we remember things. We can use anesthetics like ketamine, which can induce an amnesia. But following anesthesia, people frequently will have absolutely convincing stories that you wouldn't think possible. A fireman, post-anesthesia, tried to convince all the nurses that he sold life insurance. Well, that might not be so interesting, but he was absolutely convinced that he sold life insurance only to dead people. This was a logical fireman. We know that certain cells will shield neurons from transmitting information, and that may be in part what happens. A fascinating story occurred with a woman who received a transplant. And when she was done with the transplant, she found that she had an incredible craving for Kentucky Fried Chicken. She never liked greasy foods. She certainly didn't like Kentucky Fried Chicken. So she took it upon herself to do everything she could to find out who had donated the organ that she had been given. She was able to find that. And in talking with the family, she found that the young man who had died in a motor vehicle accident that had provided the organ had indeed had as his favorite food Kentucky Fried Chicken. I think it's interesting that our personalities are more than just our brains. When we start to think that our personalities are related to cellular memory, that I think opens the door for something that's pretty big. Because think of cellular health. Don't think of the stroke and the heart attack. Just think about what happens to our individual cells. If our individual cells are adversely impacted by environmental impacts, and we potentially disturb or destroy the cellular memory we might have. That could be problematic. For instance, what if our food chain has indeed been, quote, infiltrated by enzymes, artificial proteins, artificial saccharides, glucose, sugars? What if our highly processed food chain is indeed replete with all kinds of molecules that will disturb our cellular memory? Is it possible then that that old saying, you are what you eat, has way, way more validity than we ever gave it credit for? In other words, if we eat things that perhaps have the ability to block antioxidants, that have the ability to disturb our cellular memory, if we do those things, literally our personalities can change. In my medical business, I think I've seen that with my patients. I think I have seen personality changes not just related to the macro events of heart attacks and strokes and post-anesthetic effects. I have seen it when people move to another country, in another continent, and eat differently. Oftentimes, they'll come back with absolutely a personality that has been tweaked or sometimes remarkably reshaped. I think it's worth thinking about. I have an immense regard for Dr. Jordan Peterson. So when he called out this study indicating that it sort of blows the mind to think of how fascinating our bodies are, I agree with him. And if you want one more example of how the personality can change from impacts other than big events like strokes and heart attacks, watch this video.
There was an ethic in alchemy too that was allied in part complexly with the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. There was an ethic, and it didn't expand at the same rate. And so now we're primitive children on the ethical front with the tools of gods. And that's very, very dangerous. In fact, it might be fatally dangerous. And so one of the things that Jung attempted to do in his work was to help people understand that it was necessary for us to take on an ethical responsibility that was commensurate with our technological power, and that would require something like the deepest of all possible religious revaluations, right? The revaluation of good and evil, to use the Nietzschean phrase, as a medication for the death of God. A very serious set of ideas. And you think we're powerful now, man. You wait till the AI giant starts to stroll around the earth, and that's coming. Like, you will absolutely see that in your lifetime. You'll probably see it in the next 2 or 3 years, because that technology is moving so quickly that even those who are on top of it can't keep up. So, and I would say we better get our act together, because we could make this world quite the heavenly place, but there's a lot more pathways to hell than there are to heaven. And, by the time World War II hit, we were pretty damn technologically powerful. We could take out a lot of the world in a very short period of time, but that was nothing compared to what we can do now. So we're really at a crossroads. We could have everything we could dream of if we were careful, but we could have a nightmare beyond contemplation if we're not. And so I would say this is all on you, right? Because also, as we become technologically more powerful, every single individual becomes more powerful. And that means the corruption of the individual starts to become more and more a world destabilizing force. Well, obviously, right? Because look how connected you are. So how could it be otherwise? Right? Because that connection means your power is multiplied. Obviously, that's what it means. And that means your sins are multiplied. Really? Now, we already know the people who studied totalitarian states with any degree of depth figured out 40 years ago that a totalitarian state can only thrive if every single person in the state lies. Solzhenitsyn's claim was one man who stops lying can bring down a tyranny, which he did, by the way. Now, not alone, Reagan had something to do with that. So did the Pope at that time, and a variety of other people as well, but they were 3 cardinal individuals. And so, you look out there in the world, and You see the giants marching towards you and you think, well, what can I do? And the answer is, bloody well, get your act together, because here it comes, boys and girls, and you better be prepared. So,
isn't that interesting that memory and personality don't just reside in the brain? I think it's fascinating. We talk a lot today about artificial intelligence, and we see images that represent beautiful vistas, but those vistas don't actually exist other than through artificial intelligence. We're on a new frontier, and I think it's good for us to have our minds blown wide open and think different thoughts. When it comes to personality and intelligence and who we are as humans and what impacts us. And as always, if you'd like to visit our website, please go to drscottjensen.com. Thanks for listening. We'd love you to share the message. Have a great day.